One of the most savage and brutal kings of England was King Henry VIII, who was most famously known for the fact he had 6 wives. 2 of his wives lost their heads inside of the Tower of London, as an axeman and a swordsman would take the heads off Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Henry VIII in his final years was a shadow of his former self, and he put on a huge amount of weight following injuries he sustained in a jousting accident, which transformed his personality. Following being hit off his horse in his 30s, Henry VIII became a sharp tyrant who was likely to often experience mood swings, which would lead him to executing some of his closest friends, such as Thomas Cromwell. The king of course then regretted this action. However, in 1547, Henry VIII was gravely ill, and he would succumb to his death inside of his chambers in the Palace of Whitehall. But Henry VIII following his death was buried in a rather small vault, which is shocking considering his legacy and reputation in history. 500 years on, he remains in this burial vault against his wishes, but throughout the years Henry VIII's burial vault was broken into a number of times, and the coffin of Henry VIII was disturbed. Join us today as we look at opening the coffin of Henry VIII, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 29th of January 1547, Henry VIII died, and it was a rather strange scene compared to the chaotic nature of his reign over England. His death was very peaceful, and by his bedside was the Archbishop of Canterbury Thomas Cranmer, and Henry slipped away, and he did realise he committed a great deal of evil and sin throughout his reign. Because of this he was worried that he would not get into heaven, but Cranmer told Henry to remember these sins as death approached, and the king accepted he had committed many. But following Henry VIII's death, his body was washed inside of his bedchamber, and it was then embalmed and was left for a few days, until his death was announced to Parliament. His son Edward VI then became the new king, but Henry's heart and vital organs were removed from his body as the embalming process was carried out. It's believed that these organs were then placed inside of lead caskets and were buried in places away from where the body was laid to rest, but Henry's body was placed inside of a lead-lined casket and coffin, and it was then laid in state inside the presence chamber in Whitehall Palace. Henry VIII had said in his will to his servants and family members that he wanted to be buried alongside his 3rd wife Jane Seymour, who died following giving birth to his son Edward VI. Jane died inside of Hampton Court where she gave birth. She would never make it out of the palace alive, and she became sick following childbirth. Jane's death would change the face of English history, as if she would have survived. It's likely that Henry would have only had 3 wives, and he would have probably stuck with Jane, as she gave him everything he wanted. But her heart was removed from her body and was buried in the chapel at Hampton Court, but her body was buried inside of St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle, and this is where Henry VIII wanted to be buried. The king had his 3rd wife buried inside the choir under the floor in a burial vault, showing her importance, but Henry VIII would also commission a huge tomb to be built. This would have been the largest tomb and memorial ever made across England, and it would have been grander than that of his mother and father's inside of Westminster Abbey, and would have been 25% bigger. Henry would argue with Italian sculptors over the design, and work for this memorial did begin, and it was hoped by Henry that it would be finished one day, and that he and Jane would be interred inside the tomb, presumably in Westminster Abbey, next to the tomb of his father Henry VII and mother Elizabeth of York. But this would never be finished, as his children refused to spend a huge amount of money on this, and because of this, Henry VIII's dreams of being buried in a huge memorial would never happen. The coffin of Henry VIII was then, following the embalming, taken on a huge procession from Whitehall Palace to Windsor, and the procession was around 4 miles long. Because of the size of it, roads near Windsor had to be widened to allow it to pass by, and the hearse which carried the coffin was draped in black cloth and was pulled by 4 large horses. On top of the coffin was a wax effigy of Henry VIII, which was wearing his clothes, a cap, and carrying his royal regalia, and also the clothes had many jewels sewn into them, showing his power. Those who witnessed the procession would have been taken aback, as the effigy for many acted as the first time they'd seen their king, and his face, as portraits were not readily available for the poorer people to see. The crown was also placed on the coffin, and the funeral procession rested for the evening at Sion Abbey, to give the animals, the horses, and the guards a break for the night. There has been a rumour though established that it was here inside of the abbey that Henry VIII's remains exploded and then dripped out of the bottom of the wooden box, and were even licked at by dogs, and this may have occurred due to the gases building up inside of the body, and then being disturbed by the procession, and then the jolting. The next day, the coffin of Henry VIII made its way into Windsor, and it would be carried into the chapel by 16 strong yeomen of the guard, showing how heavy it was based on the traditional 6 guards who would carry a coffin. The funeral service for the king then took place, and after this the coffin was lowered into the burial vault, where it is still found 500 years on. The officers of Henry VIII's household, once the coffin was lowered, then broke their ceremonial staves of office and threw them into the vault. But the burial vault would be disturbed a number of times over the centuries. Henry VIII would not have been impressed by what marks his grave today, a simple marble slab that reads, "In a vault beneath this marble slab are deposited the remains of Jane Seymour, Queen of King Henry VIII, 1537, and King Henry VIII, 1547. But as mentioned, the coffin of Henry VIII was disturbed a number of times, and he was buried next to someone who he would have interpreted as one of his greatest enemies. The most important burial inside of this small vault after King Henry VIII is King Charles I, whose coffin was placed inside of the vault next to Henry's coffin. Charles I was a Stuart or a King of Scotland, and Henry during his time on the throne would ban the Stuarts from ever becoming the kings or queens of England. But following the death of Henry's daughter Queen Elizabeth I, the Stuarts were invited to become the rulers of England. But the English Civil War, which broke out in the 17th century, was caused by Charles, and this was the bloodiest conflict ever fought on English soil. Charles would be responsible for this, and he would be brought to trial following the royalist defeat, and he was then condemned to death and was executed by an axeman. Because of his reputation and the reputation of Charles and the instability caused by the Civil War, Parliament were concerned that Charles I's body would be dug up by royalists and venerated, and because of this they wanted to make sure that Charles's body was buried secretly and in quiet surroundings away from the hustle and bustle of London. Charles was buried under the cover of nightfall. Charles, under the cover of nightfall, was taken into St George's Chapel, and quietly his coffin was lowered into the burial vault, and it was placed next to the coffin of Henry VIII, which was said to have been very much larger. But to get Charles I's coffin in, workers had to move Henry's coffin to the side, and it's believed they actually damaged the coffin of Henry VIII during this, that some of the wood was damaged. Another Stuart would be added to the vault, a child belonging to Queen Anne, the last Stuart monarch, who was actually buried by the feet of Henry VIII. However, in 1813 the burial vault of King Henry VIII was broken into yet again, and building work was carried out inside the chapel and in the royal vault to make more space. But the builders entered the vault and they saw Henry VIII's coffin, but officials would go further. They would then open the coffin of King Charles I. But these men then noticed that Henry's coffin was in a bad way, and the trestle it had been placed on top of to protect it had broken and shattered, and this was done when Charles I's coffin was brought in. But the pressure from within the coffin from Henry's body may have also splintered the wood, and the top of the Tudor king's coffin was allegedly split open. There were no records made of repair works to Henry VIII's coffin, meaning that centuries later his remains may still be exposed to the air inside of the vault. Henry VIII is remembered in history today as one of the most notorious and brutal kings ever to have ruled over England. But despite his legacy, he is buried in a very quiet spot, and this is against his wishes. The king wanted a huge grand tomb, but he would never get this, and still today he lies in the same burial vault, which was meant to be temporary, 500 years on. Surely for a king as important to the story of England as Henry VIII, he deserves a much more permanent and grander memorial and monument, despite his brutality and tyrannical nature. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.